Got in preparation for what Dan has to share today. We're going to start in Jeremiah 23, verses 1 through 8. Jeremiah 23, starting at verse 1. Woe to the shepherds who are destroying and scattering the sheep of my pasture, declares the Lord. Therefore, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says to the shepherds who are tending my people. Because you have scattered my flock and driven them away and have not bestowed care on them, I will bestow punishment on you for the evil you have done, declares the Lord. I myself will gather the remnant of my flock out of all the countries where I have driven them and will bring them back to their pasture, where they will be fruitful and increase in number. I will place shepherds over them who will tend them, and they will no longer be afraid or terrified, nor will any be missing, declares the Lord. The days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will rise up David, a righteous branch, a king who will reign wisely and do what is just and right in the land. In his days, Judah will be saved, and Israel will live in safety. This is the name by which he will be called, the Lord our righteousness. So then the days are coming, declares the Lord, when people will no longer say, as surely as the Lord lives, who brought the Israelites up out of Egypt, but they will say, as surely as the Lord lives, who brought the descendants of Israel up out of the land of the north and out of the countries where he has banished them. Then they will live in their own land. And the second reading is, we're going back to Isaiah chapter 11, verses 1 through 12. Isaiah 11, starting in verse 1. A shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse. From his roots a branch will bear fruit. The Spirit of the Lord will rest on him, the Spirit of wisdom and of understanding, the Spirit of counsel and of power, the Spirit of knowledge and of the fear of the Lord, and he will delight in the fear of the Lord. He will not judge by what he sees with his eyes or decide what he hears with his ears, but with righteousness he will judge the needy. With justice he will give decisions for the poor of the earth. He will strike the earth with the rod of his mouth. With the breath of his lips he will slay the wicked. Righteousness will be his belt, and faithfulness the sash around his waist. The wolf will live with the lamb, the leopard will lie down with the goat, the calf and the lion and the yearling together, and a little child will lead them. The cow will feed with the bear, their young will lie down together, and the lion will eat straw like the ox. The infant will play near the hole of the cobra, and the young child put his hand into the viper's nest. They will neither harm nor destroy on all my holy mountain, for the earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. In that day, the root of Jesse will stand as a banner for the peoples. The nations will rally to him, and his place of rest will be glorious. In that day, the Lord will reach out his hand a second time to reclaim the remnant that is left of his people from Assyria, from Lower Egypt, from Upper Egypt, from Cush, from Elam, from Babylonia and Hamath, and from the islands of the sea. He will rise up a banner for the nations and gather the exiles of Israel. He will assemble the scattered people of Judah from the four corners of the earth. And then we're going to do our last reading is in Zechariah, near the end of the Old Testament. Zechariah 14, 2-9. Zechariah 14, starting at verse 2. I will gather all the nations to Jerusalem to fight against it. The city will be captured, the houses ransacked, the women raped. Half the city will go into exile, but the rest of the people will not be taken from the city. Then the Lord will go out and fight against those nations as he fights in the day of battle. On that day his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, east of Jerusalem, and the Mount of Olives will be split into two from east to west, forming a great valley, with half the mountain moving north and half moving south. You will flee by my mountain valley, for I will extend to Azel. You will flee as you fled from the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah. Then the Lord my God will come, and all the holy ones with him. On that day there will be no light, no cold or frost. It will be a unique day without daytime or nighttime, a day known to the Lord. When evening comes, there will be light. On that day, living water will flow from Jerusalem, half to the eastern sea and half to the western sea, in summer and in winter. The Lord will be king over the whole earth. On that day, there will be one Lord, and his name, the only name. Here ends our reading.
I don't know if you remember when we started this series, I mentioned a quote that I had read about how much prophecy there is in the Scripture. There's 27% of the Bible is predictive prophecy. There's over 1,800 prophetic passages, and over 900 of them have been fulfilled in detail. So the little survey we're doing is just a little sliver of what's there. As I was thinking about what I was going to talk about today, there's just so much that we could talk about. But our focus is on kind of tying these prophetic things that God says about the end times, that lay a foundation for what the New Testament says, what Jesus says, and what the apostles say, and what God revealed to John in the book of Revelation, so we can understand it better, because many of those things hark back to these prophetic passages from the Old Testament. But I was just thinking a couple of other experiences that are worth mentioning, because we just looked at Daniel, and Daniel has got so many sweeping prophetic pictures of civilizations that come and go, and kings that rise and fall. And in Jeremiah 22, Jeremiah is led by God to talk about the kings of Judah. And we come to the end of the lineage of kings in the Old Testament. We have Josiah and his sons. And what Jeremiah does is he basically curses them all. He says that of none of those children of the line of David that were represented in Josiah and his sons, none of them would prosper on the throne of Israel. There would not be any of them that God would use for the lineage of the Messiah. That was stunning. That was a shock. And of course, when we look back from the New Covenant, we can see that God was faithful to David. God was faithful to complete his promise to David, but he did it in a way the people didn't understand or couldn't have conceived. He used a different son of David, brought a lineage from a different son, and David is physically descended from the lineage of David's son Nathan instead of Solomon. That's just another example of how God does these incredible twists and turns that we couldn't have imagined, things we couldn't have put together, we couldn't have understood. Another example is in Isaiah. Isaiah's living at a time before the Assyrian exile happened, before the Babylonian exile happened. In fact, he's about 150 years before the Babylonian exile happened. And yet he speaks of someone God's going to use to bring the Israelites back. They aren't even gone yet. And God is saying he's going to choose this man, and he even names him. Cyrus. Cyrus will be the one who will bring the people back. So these are just two more examples of the same kind of thing we've been talking about. And it's important for us to realize that this is who God is. God knows the end from the beginning. He can declare to us how things are going to turn out. And the secret things, the hidden things, belong to Him. But the things He's revealed belong to us. They're meant to encourage us, to instruct us, to help us to see this is the God we have working in our lives. This is the God who's part of my walk every day. He's directing my steps. He's directing your steps. So today's kind of a wind-up of the prophecies I want to talk about in the Old Covenant, and we're going to move to the New Covenant, to the New Testament next week, because we're going to focus a little more. But it's important to see that what's in these other books, even though it's not as concentrated as what was in Daniel, there's a lot of information there. There's a lot more we could talk about. So we got these three passages that we looked at. We looked at Jeremiah 23. We looked at Isaiah 11 and Zechariah 14. And in these three passages, we get a lot of information. We find out that God is going to bring His people back from all the nations of the world. Now, Jeremiah lived just one generation after Isaiah. He lived about 605 BC is when he's prophesying. A little before that, 621 BC. And at that time, the northern kingdom had been taken into exile into Assyria, and they were on the edge of being taken captive by the Babylonians. It hadn't happened yet, but it was going to happen. And so God is speaking through Jeremiah, and He's telling him that He's going to bring His people back. Now, if you look at the notes, you'll notice that there's 18 times that I listed where God is talking about the fact He's going to bring His people back from other nations. Actually, it starts with Moses in Deuteronomy. Moses is the one who's telling them, he's warning them, if you don't obey Yahweh, if you don't follow God, God will discipline you. God will bring consequences into your life, and it will go from bad to worse. The more stubborn you are, the more resistant you are, the more you refuse to obey God, God will turn up the heat. He'll raise the ante. Until finally, God will expel you from this land of promise that He's brought you into. And then in Deuteronomy 30, Moses said, and when you're in that land, it's going to happen. When you're in that land, if you remember Yahweh your God, turn your heart toward Him and begin to seek Him, humble yourself before Him, God will gather you from those places that He drove you to, that He expelled you from this land to live in. God will bring you back. So that was 1440 BC that Moses and the Exodus took place. Then we got Jeremiah 621 BC, and we got Zechariah, who's even later. He's around 500 BC. And they're all talking about the same thing, that God is going to drive the Israelites out from the land for their disobedience, and He would bring them back. He would bring back a portion. 17 different times besides Moses. Over 5 different prophetic writers, God revealed these prophecies to. and they're recorded in our Scripture. Now, I wasn't even trying to be exhaustive. I wasn't like I went around tried to figure out how many times. Just as I was studying, I came across 17 other times besides Moses that I wrote down in my notes. There's probably more. I wasn't trying to be exhaustive. God wants us to see this is an important prophecy. In fact, God says that this is even more significant than when he brought the Israelites out of Egypt. I mean, that's the birth of the nation of Israel, as he brought them out of slavery to Egypt. And yet God says that the fact that he's going to bring them from all these other countries is the way he's going to be known. He's going to be known for that, even above the fact that he brought them out of bondage in Egypt. He's going to be known as the God who brings the Israelites from all the nations around the world. He's going to bring them back. Now, if you were a Jew living at the time of Jeremiah, this would have sounded pretty crazy. If you lived at the time of Isaiah, it would have sounded even more crazy. Because by the time of Jeremiah, the 10 tribes had already been brought to Assyria. And then right after Jeremiah, the southern kingdom was brought to Babylon. And then God, after 70 years, just like it was prophesied, God brought them back. Now, it was only a remnant that came back, only a portion that came back. And God said that too. Part of the reason for the exile was because of disobedience, was because of rebellion, was because of stubbornness, because of unbelief, because they didn't want to honor God. And so it's not surprising that of those that came back, it wasn't the ones who didn't regard God. It wasn't the ones who wanted to honor God. It was the people who were looking for the promises of God who came back. Because there was nothing to come back to. Everything had been destroyed. Jerusalem had been obliterated. Even the stone walls had been torn down. The land was overrun by thorns. There was nobody keeping the fields tilled. It had been 70 years. They were going to have to clear the land again. They're going to have to build houses again. It wasn't a cushy thing to come into. It was like being a settler coming into a strange land. And the people that came were motivated to come because they wanted to follow Yahweh. Well, you look at that, just in itself is amazing. But you look at those exiles, and they were kind of regional exiles. It was people brought to Assyria, and then people brought to Babylonia. And then what God tells Isaiah is that he's going to bring them from all the countries around the world. They're going to come from islands, and he lists a whole bunch of places. They're going to be coming from Greece. They're going to be coming from islands in the distance. They're going to be coming from Tarshish, which is over by Spain. They're going to be coming from all over the place, all around the world. It talks about a second exile. So they come back from the first exile, which was global or was regional, and the prophets are talking about another exile that's going to be global. The Jews are going to be scattered all around the world. And that happened too. That began in 70 AD when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem. They tore down the temple. They pushed all the stones off the Temple Mount. They're still off the Temple Mount today. And the Jews were scattered. They were Many of them were killed, and then others were brought into slavery. For 100 years, they weren't allowed to live in the city of Jerusalem. And throughout the centuries, there was very few Jews that lived in the land of Palestine. They were scattered all around the world. But in the late 1800s, God began to put it on people's hearts to go back to Jerusalem. Some Jews saw these prophetic passages and they began to pray over them. They began to say, the next year in Jerusalem. They began to pray that they could go back. In 1891, there was 25,000 Jews that lived in the whole land of Palestine. It was pretty sparse. The land was still like a desert. But with the First World War and then the British giving the land of Israel to the Jews, because the Jews kept coming. The Jews started to come, and they came as refugees. They came by boat. They came any way they could, and they went to the land, and they couldn't stop them from coming. So one of the things that the British did is they gave them a part of the land. They said, well, okay, you can have this part. And then after Hitler and the final solution, the Nazis, to try to kill the Jews, people had compassion on the Jews, and they gave them more land. And they allowed them to become a state. They became a nation again after 1,900 years. And in 1948, they became the nation we know as Israel. We've all grown up with Israel being there. But 150 years ago, if someone had talked about these prophecies, they would have thought that was ridiculous. How would the Jews ever come back to Palestine? How would they ever come from all these other nations? Well, they have come from every nation. They've come from America, they've come from South America, they've come from Australia, they've come from the Philippines, they've come from Russia, they've come from Poland. They come from everywhere because they were scattered everywhere. And now there's almost 8 million of them in Israel. 8 million Jews in Israel, and about that many Jews that don't live in Israel. Isn't that interesting? So God has started to call His people back, bring His people back, and they're still coming back. And He's not done bringing them back. So one of the significant prophecies, one of the things that's going to happen before the end, is God is bringing His people back, the Jews back to their land. And we have seen it. We have seen it happen in our grandparents' and parents' life and our life. It's happening today. There are Jews from Africa, Jews from every part of the world you can imagine. And they keep coming. They keep coming. And what we read is that in the end, when the Messiah comes, He will be a standard. He will be like a banner. And the people will really come. God's gonna dry up the Euphrates so people can walk over on foot. God's gonna do all kinds of things to bring His people back. So what we've seen already, that's just the beginning. Another thing that's really significant that's going to happen is that nations are going to gather against Israel. And there's a bunch of prophecies about that. It talks about it over and over again. Nations are going to come and attack Israel. In Ezekiel 38 and 39, it talks about how the nations are going to gather against Israel. They're going to come from the north. They're going to come from the south. They're going to come into the land. And God is going to destroy them. God is going to use an earthquake. He's going to use fire. He's going to use huge hailstones. He's going to decimate them. And there'll be so many dead dead people from God's wrath, that it's going to take 6 months to bury the dead bodies. They're going to have a mass grave where they're going to bury the bodies. And it's going to take 7 months, It's going to take 7 months to cleanse the land. And then it'll be 7 years where they'll be burning parts of their weaponry for fuel, because it's just scattered everywhere. We haven't seen that yet. That's something to watch for. That's going to happen. In Zechariah, it talks about how at the end, they're going to come from every nation. Now, we don't know if these two passages are talking about the same event. It would seem that they are. They're going to come from every nation, and they're going to gather to try to go against Israel. And they're actually going to take the city. They're going to conquer the city of Jerusalem, and they're going to start coming through the city, taking spoil, abusing the women, killing everybody. And then it says Yahweh's going to come. Yahweh's going to come, and he's going to touch down on the Mount of Olives. Mount of Olives will be split in half. It'll be split right down the middle, east and west. And if you were in Jerusalem, the Mount of Olives is just to the east of the city. And so there will be a valley, an opening, a corridor that will be opened up so people can flee the city and go right through that valley to this place called Azel, which is just a little riverbed on the other side of the Mount of Olives. They'll be able to escape. And then it says Yahweh will come with all his holy ones with him. And that's the final battle. God will destroy his enemies. That's in Zechariah. We haven't seen that yet. And then the world is going to be changed. On that day, the whole world's going to be changed. The sun won't be in the sky like it is. Things will look different. There'll be light, but not lights. There'll be no more curse. People's lifespan will be extended. They'll live like the life of a tree, it says. And if a child dies before it's 100 years old, it'll be thought to be a tragedy. So there'll be death, but people will live much longer than they do now. And there will be no more carnivorous animals. Wolves will be able to lie down with lambs. Children will be able to play by the hole of a cobra and not be afraid. None of the stuff that we've had to be afraid of or that we've seen in our life, all that will be gone. And God will provide blessing for everybody who obeys him. But they're required to go up every year to celebrate the Feast of Booths. The Feast of Booths in Jerusalem was a time when they would gather and remember the wilderness wandering where God provided for them. And there will be nations who will oppose that, who will resist God, even in that time. And if they choose to do that, God will not give them any rain. Try that for a while. So this period of time that's talked about, it's not heaven. And it's not the new earth. It's the millennial kingdom. We looking back from what we see in the new covenant. But it's what the Jews were given this revelation about this time where God would be king and where everything would be different and they would reign with God. Also, in conjunction with the return of Israel, there's different events that are going to happen. With one of these returns, God was going to establish a new covenant. That happened after the Babylonian exile. It was a few hundred years, but then God established a new covenant through Jesus, 30 AD. God brought in a new group of people, the nations. We have a whole new thing going on that the Jews didn't have before that time. We have the opportunity to have a new heart and a new spirit. We have a chance to be made different on the inside. The people in the Old Covenant under the Old Testament, they didn't have that. That was something that came with Jesus. So there's all kinds of things that are revealed to us in these prophecies about the shift in this age, things that are going to happen, that are going to come to pass, things that God brought to pass that we can look at, and things that are still yet to come. So the things we're to look for now, we're to look for the return of the people. We're to look for the possibility of a temple being built in Jerusalem, because Ezekiel talks quite a bit about a temple being built in Jerusalem. Some people look at that and they say, well, that could never happen. Well, yeah, we didn't think any of this stuff could happen. It appears as though God's going to put a temple there from the Old Covenant perspective. God's going to cause the nations to come against Israel. Those are three big things to watch for. And we see enough animosity toward Israel, it's not hard to imagine that could happen. But it's going to come to a head. And when that happens, everything's going to come to an end. So it's important for us who are believers to recognize what God is doing and to take advantage of the time that we have now. God didn't reveal this stuff to us so we would just tuck it in our back pocket and think about it and think how good we have it. God's telling us this so we can understand it, we can be praying about it, and we can share it with people as we see these things unfold. Because they will unfold. We'll see it happen. Or our children will see it happen. Because the God who has done these amazing things throughout history is still the God who's steering the ship. He's the one who's still in the driver's seat. And he hasn't made a mistake yet. So we know he's going to bring it to an end, and we know he's going to do it just as he said. We might not understand how he's going to do it, but we know he will. And so in our lives, as we come to terms with this, again, like I said last time, we need to understand that this God who is directing history is also directing my life and your life. He's at work in your life and my life. I just had an experience the other day where I was meeting with a guy who had just made a big step in his faith toward God. And we've been meeting for a while, and he shared with me how he had made a mistake, and he had something to drink, and he'd seen a side of himself he hadn't seen ever. And as he was preparing to come and meet with me, this voice came in his head. Why don't you just tell Dan that you took a job out of state and that you're leaving? He said, well, that's ridiculous. Why would I do that? But it's interesting. It's interesting that he's taken a step toward God, and something is pushing back. And we talked about it. And he saw how ridiculous that was, and that was not his heart. That was not his thought. He also saw the enemy was at work in his life and parts of his life. So just being able to talk about this stuff helped him to see the reality of the warfare that's going on, the reality of God at work and the enemy at work. We all need to know that. We all need to know that this is real stuff. God is at work and the enemy is at work. And we're right in the middle. And our role makes a difference. We certainly make a difference in the lives of those that we interact with. But as we intercede and we pray, it says we can we can be looking for, expecting, and hastening the day of God. Somehow your participation and my participation in prayer and obedience will bring these things to pass more rapidly, more effectively, at least in terms of the people who escape damage. You know, where the enemy is operating, that he's stealing, he's killing, he's destroying. Where we can have impact, where we can become focused and be the glove in God's hand or the mouthpiece for his voice, we can help people see what's going on so that they can escape the enemy's hands. They can escape his schemes. They can align themselves with God so they can escape the damage and the bondage and the brokenness that the enemy wants to put into their lives. Well, anybody got any questions or observations or thoughts?